Before I begin, I just wanted to throw a couple of things out there, really. I guess one of them is something that I heard at the GLAA conference last week, which I found really powerful and was a big take-home for me. Marshalls as an organisation is working really hard to make its supply chain and its business operations really toxic to modern slavery. And we've heard talk of the corporate victim of modern slavery, and I guess if we were to uncover slavery in our supply chain, or something was to break around the fact that we have got slavery in our supply chain, then I would think that we would fit the bill, if you like, as a corporate victim, because we've been working very hard, and I can demonstrate to you how we've been working very hard. But the language, and I think there's an interesting issue around kind of language in this arena that I heard was kind of new to my ears at the conference, and that was, what about the corporate witness? What about the organisation that sees it and does nothing at all about it? What also about the corporate perpetrator who actually sets out to profit? And for me, that was just, I think, if you can kind of frame, I guess, or think about that as in terms of your businesses and your business lives, are you happy to be seen as a corporate victim, the witness, or the perpetrator? Because I think at some point you will get asked that question. So if you think from the macro end of that thought, I wanted to take you to the micro end of it. And I have a prop here. It wasn't quite what I was after, but a prop nonetheless. I have a box of sugar. I wanted a bag of sugar. And this is cubed sugar, so it's probably slightly more expensive than a bag of sugar. And I have it here as a prop because it's something that we all have every day in our homes. And when I recently went to Vietnam, the price of this bag of sugar, or this box of sugar, was the cost of a woman. This is what it cost to get for a woman to be trafficked into slavery. So her family were given a box of sugar, and off she went, deceived into thinking that she was going to a better life, and ended up trafficked. And she was trafficked from Vietnam into China, and she was sexually exploited, and she also ended up working in construction. At the kind of lower ends of construction, kind of clearing debris. And you may well say, well, what has that got to do with me, or what has it to do with me? I feel it has something to do with me, because although she's not directly in my supply chain, she lives in the vulnerable, kind of remote quarrying regions from where our Vietnamese granite comes from. So in the same way that I couldn't turn a blind eye to that if something was happening on my doorstep in Elland, in Yorkshire, I can't turn a blind eye if that's happening in my supply chain in Vietnam. And I think in all of the things I'm going to talk to you about, one of the things that we place at the centre of our modern slavery response is the victim, a victim-centred response. And that might maybe sound like an odd thing for a corporate to say. I'm sure there are other NGOs in the room who think that that's perhaps their remit, but we put the victim firmly at the centre of our response. So I'm going to talk to you about our risk mapping, the modern slavery risk mapping that we've been doing. And it actually sounds a little bit dry, and I wouldn't want you to go away and think that all that we do is risk mapping and crunching numbers, and I apologise in advance because I've got some graphs because I want you to know that I've done the work, but you're not going to be able to see the detail behind them, although you will be able to go online because it's all freely available. So I'm going to weave within that some of the kind of examples of what we've done with that information, or how that guides what it is we will do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Marshall's approach, about the risk mapping process, so how we've done that profiling, how that's helped us to set our modern slavery priorities, and then a bit of a look at our Indian supply chain. I think something else that I've heard running throughout today, and also in the conversations that I've had in the breakouts, is that top-down buy-in is massively important. And actually, in some conversations, I start to feel quite bad because I think I have an easier job than some of my colleagues, because the organisation that I work for and the board totally get why we're doing what we're doing. And I've got this quote up here from Martin Kofi, our CEO, and he knows and is totally engaged. He knows that we're trying our best to be well informed and that we're well connected. And also, I think as the language around this has matured, he and the board are totally committed and unafraid to report transparently on what we find. And I think that's been a step. I think that comfort to disclose transparently has taken some building, if you like. So we have a net positive approach. So we talked earlier, there was some talk about the drafting of statements from a legal perspective or from a CSR perspective. I draft our statement. It comes from a business and human rights perspective. And it actually, we're looking to not just fulfill our legal compliance or to mitigate and remediate, but actually to really make a positive contribution. So later on, I'll come back and tell you what we're doing in that Vietnamese setting in terms of perhaps what is within our ability to do, but with that in mind, actually making some kind of positive contribution. Again, something that I've heard a kind of a theme of today, there's total congruence between our business model, which is a sustainable business model. It's based around the UNGC principles of labour, human rights, anti-corruption, environment, the brand mission of creating better spaces, and the values. And we have total joined up thinking, which again is really makes my job a lot more simple, I think, than it would be otherwise. And that goes from the top, but also to the bottom. So through to our transport fleet, through to procurement, through to HR and sales, through to marketing. Somebody recently, I was speaking with somebody and they said, oh, yes, you and your team. I said, no, there is me. There is no team. That's not my desire for the business. The business needs everybody to understand what it is that we're doing and where business impacts human rights and to do their part. This is not something that you will silo away into a team. And therefore, I need to work with and engage with all my colleagues throughout the whole business. Again, that victim-focused perspective, that's really particularly important to me. It matters to me about how a victim is treated, that they're not just flicked out of our supply chain or flicked out of our business operations without a second thought. And we recognise where we have strengths and what we can offer. So if it's within our power to offer that victim a job and it's appropriate to do so, then we will certainly do that, but we will be guided by our anti-slavery partner, Hope for Justice, in terms of doing that. Something I've not heard any talk of today is actually commercialising our modern slavery efforts, and I don't particularly find any discomfort in saying that out loud. I think for us to have a clear goal in terms of what we're doing, a clear programme of work, and at this point in time to seek to differentiate our products, our brand, then I'm actually very comfortable with that. And I guess one of the questions I've had floating around my head back to the floor, maybe for later, is, what does it take for organisations or contractors to specify products and services from those organisations who are actually making an effort, writing a statement that is full of intent, and or not putting out a non-statement or in fact engaging. We're also seeking to engage with our suppliers, our partners, our customers and our communities. And as far as I'm concerned, there are no grounds for not collaborating to eradicate modern slavery. There are no commercial secrets to be given away in the attempt to stop the organised crime behind modern slavery. And and also embracing the GLAA construction protocol, as Marshall's did last week. So I'm going to just look at how we've there's been lots of talk about lots of the data that's available out there. And actually, we were seeking to make that really meaningful for our business. So we analysed external data. So we had input from stakeholders, and I'll tell you who they were in a minute, to look at what information we should analyse in relation to, and then relate that to each of our sourcing countries. So we looked at access to banking, health, education and living standards, elimination of child labour, gender equality, government efforts to combat human trafficking, labour rights, public sector, corruption and the rule of law. So we consulted with our range of stakeholders to say, do you think that these are good drivers? Do you think that these are some of the things that we should look at? So we refined in certain areas and we agreed upon those drivers. So I'm not going to go through all of the drivers, but I'm just going to kind of pick out, if you like, just 2 or 3 of them. So in terms of access to banking, we picked out the World Bank data that looks at what proportion of the population owns a bank account in a given country. And we understand that victims of modern slavery often don't have control over their own bank accounts, but what we do understand is, what we wanted to understand was what the infrastructure was like, so what was available to the general population. So in terms of health and education and standard of living, we looked at the IHDI information, and there were a number of important factors that contributed to the risk of modern slavery within the country. And I think what was really helpful in terms of looking at this data was that the index adjusted scores for inequality, so it reduced any possible skew in terms of what we were then working with. And finally, we were also looking at rule of law and public sector corruption in terms of government effectiveness, rule of law, and the control of corruption. And again, we know that is clearly, not done well, offers the huge potential for modern slavery to go unchecked. So I've got a couple of graphs coming up. Please don't strain your eyes. I literally wanted to show you that we've done the work. So we use these in kind of different shapes and forms. It is all available. We have posted it all. But what we did is we took that information and we did risk comparisons for each sourcing country. Including the UK. So we've done this retrospectively, so all of our sourcing countries, but it's part of our due diligence, so we do that for everything moving forward. And it's proved to be a very useful tool in that respect. We then overlaid that with analysis of our own internal data. So looking at the categories, the kind of procurement categories, so indirect purchases, goods for resale and raw materials, we'd looked at volume and volume of product and also cost of purchase. And that had given us some really, really interesting information in terms of where we thought we ought to focus. So we knew prior to doing this work that a huge risk area for us was indeed natural stone, which we sourced from around the world. This, to a certain extent, kind of, if you like, gave us a thumbs up for that. But it also put some other places, I think, further up the radar that possibly wouldn't have been there had we not done this. And interestingly, shortly after we'd done this, the Verisk Maplecroft information came out. And I was pleased to say that we were pretty much on the same page, which again was helpful to us. So our current geographical focus is India, Vietnam, Italy, Turkey, and the UK. And from my perspective, the focus is what's required because it's depth of activity in terms of what we're doing there. Not, I definitely don't want to just skate across what should be done, have the policies in place, and then for them to actually not translate or not mean anything on the ground. So I'm thinking of this kind of more from a Mary Berry kind of style, kind of binding things in to the process that we're going through. So our focus there for the remainder of this year, it will continue, but we'll add things into it. So next year we'll be looking in more detail at China, at Brazil, and at Germany. So I also wanted to just mention that we can analyse the external data, we can analyse the internal data, but there's also the kind of intelligence and insights that we get, or that I get when I'm out networking and having discussions, and certainly networking with our local law enforcement in terms of where we have big sites, because we've got about 52 of them throughout the UK. And engaging with the anti-slavery activities from a West Yorkshire police network perspective, because they're kind of quite a flagship for this. So we can take that information and also act upon that alongside the other data that we have. So we'd looked at temporary labour providers in the UK because that was an obvious place to look and ask those questions. And there's a more of a tale to tell around that specific issue, but really we ended up agreeing that we would work on a pilot programme to educate the agents that provided workers into them that were then provided to us, and that they would continue that piece of work. So that's a pilot that lasted for 6 months and has been taken up by them and monitored by us. We have Marshall's installer register. So if you have your patio or driveway installed, we have an approved installer's register. I don't know if you've probably seen in the news, patios and driveways, there were some recent convictions for a travelling community that held people in slavery and forced them to undertake that kind of work. So to our 1,500 installers, we pretty much immediately, having had this conversation with the West Yorkshire Police, took that information, translated it into something meaningful for our installers register, talked to them about the moral message that it wasn't right, also the commercial message. If people are out there undercutting you, it may not be you, hopefully not you, that's using slavery, but your competitors are likely to be using slaves if they're able to undercut you to such an extent. And also you're the eyes and ears. So we rolled that out, and they had training on top of that, and we had 3 pieces of information, intelligence back within 24 hours, and 5 pieces back overall, and 3 of those are currently under investigation. So I think I hadn't foreseen that would be a way in which we could play our part or contribute, I guess, to the elimination of slavery. But I guess my message is, you can talk about the macro stuff, but actually it has to translate into grassroots, and that shouldn't be overlooked. In terms of our supplier engagement in Vietnam, I'd gone out last year to Vietnam and had various conversations with local officials, government officials in different places, actually I wanted to know more about trafficking from that area. I wanted to know more about forced labour. It was a very difficult and stilted conversation to have. Spurred on actually by the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's drive to understand the trafficking of Vietnamese nationals into the UK, primarily Scotland, actually. So to understand that bigger picture, alongside our anti-slavery partner, we went and had those conversations, and as a result of understanding that there are vulnerable people in the rural areas around the quarries, and that actually where we felt we could immediately possibly add some value would be by funding a programme that would enable NGOs, in-country NGOs, to be trained on the issues of trafficking, and that they would go in and actually let people know that even though they thought they might be migrating, that they would most likely end up being trafficked, and actually there was no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And I think somebody made a point earlier about, I think it might have been Helen from the Sustainability School, about the Vietnamese boy or man that was found and did not want to go back. Often it will be because sometimes there is a significant cost to migrating. So if you wanted to migrate from a rural area, the community would come together and bring forward what money they had to send you, because you were going to have a better life and you were going to send money back to the village. So effectively, you pay, and according to the Anti-Slavery Commissioner's report, you can travel economy class for like $8,000, probably strapped under a lorry, or pay up to $30,000 and maybe travel in a slightly different fashion. But the end result is the same. You still end up enslaved somewhere that you didn't expect to be, and actually you can't ever go home. You know, it's way too complicated. And regardless of what our mechanisms are here for supporting victims, I sure as hell know if I was one of them and that was my situation and that's how I'd come to be there, I don't think I'd be that keen to go back. In terms of our Indian supply chain, we've heard talk this morning about the length of time required to see change. And I was kind of laughing with Emma earlier and saying, I've accepted the fact that I'll probably be dead before I see significant change, whether it's in relation to child labour in India or anything else. And I kind of laugh when I say that, but I think that's probably true. But I think the long term, you know, the tiny movements and the long term is something that we have to accept. We've had a long-term relationship with our supplier in India. We collapsed the supply chain to be for them to be a sole supplier, which offered many benefits, and many of those kind of coming to the fore when we're talking to them about modern slavery. So the fact that we've been working with them on these human rights issues, even if we've not termed them human rights since 2005, has really helped. What we're doing out there with our suppliers is a face-to-face supply chain visits and conversations regarding modern slavery, so bringing them along with us on that journey and, you know, dealing with the frequent challenges, you know, which is it's culturally acceptable, you know, there's, so there's no desire to change, and also the lack of infrastructure in the country or in the region, and also the lack of understanding in terms of financial remediation, either that should be sought by the victim or that should be offered by the organisation. So there's a big piece of ongoing work around that. Enhanced ethical auditing and modern slavery risk assessment programme, we've also got that in place. And I know our auditing team within the organisation was saying, well, just give me a few questions I can add into the audit. I was like, the modern slavery process or risk assessment process definitely does not work that way, because essentially it's a dialogue and you have to go and you have to ask the questions, and you also have to be ready to take up that piece of intelligence and run with it often there and then, which is why I found it extremely helpful to have an investigative NGO on board, such as Hope for Justice. So we've got a wider programme of intelligence gathering going on at the moment. Some of that are kind of covert, and wider sectoral research regarding temporary licensed and unlicensed labour brokers, because that for me is a very murky area, specifically in relation to the stone sector in Rajasthan. Definitely key engagement with key actors, and this has been ongoing for a long time. And our focus at the moment is developing a programme of remediation with Hope for Justice. We work with them in the UK and also overseas, which is victim-centred, but also in a rural context, say around Kota, you know, in the kind of rural areas around Kota, actually thinking about the personal safety of that victim and of their families, because it's often not that straightforward. And if you're kind of cutting across perhaps the cobbling mafia, if you didn't know there was such a thing, then you know, you've got to think smart and you've got to be careful. And also looking into their financial remediation for them. So that's work that's all ongoing for us and is kind of directed by the analysis that we've done. Just a quick word on KPIs. We've got really clear KPIs in relation to our modern slavery statement, not least of which is developing a process of remediation and support. And we've committed to, by May 2018, making sure that that is in place for 50% of our supply chain identified as high risk by volume of product. So I look forward to updating you on that in May. We're doing further analysis and mapping because it's fun when you actually get into it, and really useful. Yeah. So we've lots of the information that I've talked about, or additional information and links to the stuff that I've shown you today, can be found on our website, together with our End Modern Slavery report, which gives a fuller flavour of what it is that we've been doing. Okay, thank you.